Welcome to the Capital Compass, the podcast that helps healthcare leaders navigate the journey to value and complex decisions shaping capital planning and investment strategy. Today, we're tackling a challenge that healthcare executives across the country know all too well. How do you continue investing in critical equipment, infrastructure, and technology when operating margins remain under pressure? The need for capital investment hasn't slowed. Organizations are balancing aging equipment, growing demand for advanced technologies, workforce challenges, and evolving patient expectations, all while managing the delicate balance of financial constraints, patient care, and operational priorities. Joining us today are two experts who work closely with healthcare organizations who are facing these types of decisions every day. Danny Cisneros, Associate Principal with Capital Equipment Solutions at Vizient, helps clients optimize capital investments and procurement strategies. He's joined by John Nickvis, Senior Vice President at Kaufman Hall, where he advises healthcare organizations on financial planning, capital allocation, and long-term strategic growth. Together, we're going to explore how leading organizations are prioritizing investments, evaluating creative funding models, and building capital strategies that support today's reality and tomorrow's opportunities. John, Danny, welcome to the Capital Compass. We've got a lot to talk about today. John, give us a sense of today's financial environment with our large healthcare organizations, and what impact do you think it is having on financial capital planning decisions?
Yeah, thank you. We're living in a world where every dollar matters for these healthcare systems, and having some discipline and strategy around how to pay for equipment is very important. Historically and even currently, facilities, major strategic investments receive a lot of financial discipline, whereas equipment historically has been a bit of an afterthought. It's often reactionary. And these systems have an opportunity to focus in on equipment spending and equipment finance in particular, and treating it more as a strategic decision, which will help them preserve cash and improve capital efficiency, maximize financial flexibility.
Talk a little bit more about that discipline. What is it that good organizations do that some of the followers maybe haven't quite learned yet?
In general, somebody needs to take control of the process. You have many departments that are involved, and that often means that nobody owns the process. You get downstream towards the end of a lease or the end of a financing of equipment, and nobody's paying attention to it. This can lead to evergreen extensions, keeping equipment much longer than you intend to, working with vendors that have difficult end-of-term requirements, which may force you into decisions that you don't want to make. Taking ownership of that upfront is very important for these systems.
So post-COVID, systems are looking at this process differently. How are they evaluating and approving these capital requests?
For equipment finance in particular, it's an interesting time frame because there was also an accounting change that happened in terms of how you account for these equipment leases, which affects finance and treasury in particular. This has sort of led to the amplification of this workaround or avoiding finance to make the final decision with all sorts of new embedded leases, which is the formal accounting name for them, but a bunch of different names for these placement agreements, combining services, software, disposables, reagents, you name it, into one package with the intention of avoiding a strategic capital decision.
Do you see that avoidance becomes part of that discipline problem?
Lack of discipline, absolutely.
I think it even goes down to those placement agreements. I'm sure you've probably seen as well, where there's these large contract repositories. You ask several different stakeholders within an organization, what does that replacement look like? Oh, well, that lands with Jerry, or that lands with Joe over here. I've not seen a good auditing practice even for those placement agreements due to the nature of how things change. Somebody has to be constantly working on that. I mean, have you seen that at all?
Yes. Each one of those placement agreements typically includes a right-of-use asset, which is technically an equipment lease, which is technically supposed to go on the balance sheet. You've now got a spiderweb of placement agreements, anything from a big major vendor that you have a lot of equipment with down to maybe a one-off smaller vendor that you may or may not do business with again in the future. It's this spider web of contracts that Jerry owns for the time being and tomorrow somebody else owns. That can lead to lots of equipment risk and strategic risk, but also accounting risk, audit risk.
Do you find in your space that there are also SMEs specific in the financy world where it's like capital medical equipment and realty, and those are two completely different sets of subject matter expertise that is really just bucketed under kind of a generalist?
Absolutely. And while they both affect the balance sheet, they are incredibly different. One's an appreciating asset, one's a depreciating asset, and you have to think about them very differently. The contracts are different. Oftentimes, it'll be a business department person who happen to know a particular equipment with a vendor. Maybe 10 years ago, we have one client where the head of nursing is still the person that owns a particular leasing agreement relationship, because 10 years ago, the first piece of equipment that they leased was a nursing focused piece of equipment. She developed the relationship and she still manages like all of the payables for that leasing company. They're now leasing computers and servers and printers.
It's because our hospital systems often just rely on this legacy knowledge set of this person's been here for 20 years. Just go see Linda. And it's like, well, Linda was never really supposed to be in charge of this. Right. We were a much smaller organization then, but now that we've grown, Linda's still in charge of it. And her duties just keep expanding.
Yeah, we see this a lot. That's clearly, obviously not a best practice.
Danny, as the capital equipment solutions subject matter expert.
Subject matter expert, that's dangerous.
Gotta call them like we see them. From the equipment side, what investment priorities are you seeing rise to the top given the financial pressures our leaders are facing today?
We don't have it. We're starting to see clients or healthcare providers generally look at this space where they historically haven't. Usually it's in PPI, it's in med-surg, it's in pharmacy, things that are dealing directly with clinical outcomes, patient care, things like that. Not really understanding that these equipment innovations that are happening in the marketplace also affect how patients are received and how the outcome of those procedures are done. Clinicians are starting to get louder too about this. Risks are starting to build. There's been 4, 5, 6 cyber breaches just this year, accounting for millions of dollars to leak from the facility. It's no longer a landscape where you can just throw the capital equipment in a storage facility and then just hopefully get it refurbished, get it back on the floor, or just get something that we trust from the local reps, the recommendation of our local reps. John, you probably agree to this. That's really where the space has been today. It's, what did my local rep say? Well, the local rep said that you needed a new piece of equipment because Q4 is ending.
Yeah, it's reactionary instead of strategic and proactive. Oftentimes, you're focusing on replacing something that should have been retired last year, and you're constantly chasing that. You're constantly a year or two behind, which doesn't allow you to catch up and doesn't allow you to plan properly. What
is the guidance for the organizations that are looking for balance between urgent operational needs and longer-term strategic investments?
What it isn't is circumventing your capital approval process through signing a placement agreement or some version of a placement agreement so that you don't have to go to your CFO for approval. It is a rethinking of that strategic capital process and planning for the future, knowing that it won't be right, but at least putting thought into it. And that will ultimately avoid all sorts of reactionary, lumpy, big payments, fire drills, and allow you to evaluate not just the type of equipment that you need and why you need it and when you need it, but how you should pay for it. What does a placement agreement look like when compared to traditional financing, whether it be a finance lease or a fair market value operating lease or some version of that, or just paying cash maybe in some instances? Getting ahead of that process and bringing finance into the process earlier on the equipment finance side of things is very important. When the process gets stuck in a certain business unit or a certain supply chain, and then they go to the finance or sometimes don't go to finance and say, okay, this is what we need, sign here. It's too late. At that point, maybe you sign it, maybe you get it, but you still haven't solved that issue. You're still a year behind. You're still not planning properly.
The equipment didn't become 12 years old yesterday. And if we are waiting until it's the quote process, then potentially by the time that quote gets to sourcing, 70% of that cost has already been figured out. It's already sort of baked in. Things that are not associated with the rest of that is things like service, IT, the workaround it's taken. Whenever it gets bottlenecked into that approval process, a lot of our supplier community only holds it for the next 60 days. So if it's a flat out purchase, we're already on the back foot. I don't think healthcare systems necessarily have a finance problem with some of these equipment. It's really a visibility problem.
Help us understand a little bit how these pieces of equipment that have long life cycles wind up not showing up in the balance sheet in the appropriate way, and how they sort of get hidden underneath those hidden costs of deferred maintenance and some of those things. How does that really show up?
I'll say on my side, whenever we see how members are prioritizing this, even before and after sort of that quote has already happened or they're already in process or negotiation with a supplier to actually procure that equipment, there is not always a lot of visibility from sourcing on what should be CapEx and what should be OpEx. It floats between those balance sheets.
That is absolutely true. And too often in the marketplace, systems are relying on their suppliers or their vendors to make that decision for them. I see this all the time. It's really not an analogy. You'll have a supplier say, here's what you get as part of this. You get your supplies and you get your service and you get consulting and your implementation, and then you get this equipment. And because it's got all these things, it's not an equipment purchase, it's not an equipment lease. So it's the low price of X per month, and you don't have to worry about it being a lease. And right below that on their email, it says in the fine print, like, I cannot give accounting advice. Please don't listen to anything that I say. So the reality is it's a finance and treasury decision. I don't want to get too deep in the accounting weeds here, but anytime you have a right of use of a piece of equipment, it is an embedded lease and something needs to go on your balance sheet. That's when I say finance and treasury needs to be involved earlier in the process. Not only will it result in a lower overall total cost of ownership, but it will also reduce the risk of misaccounting for something.
Danny, tell us, at what point does extending the life of an asset actually become more expensive than replacing it? Because it sounds like we're talking about how the dollars get shuffled and how they show up in the P&Ls. It's got to show up somewhere.
If a piece of equipment that is related to a procedure is not in the room, if some sort of preventative maintenance being done, then patients aren't allowed to be seen there. I've seen it all too many different times where an entire OR is potentially shut down for the day because an autoclave or something like that is down. You're not able to process Dr. Edwards' spine set or whatnot for the day. It's just down. So you have to shuffle those cases around, get all those patients rescheduled. That's a ton of administrative work. You're losing money there. You're losing money in the OR. Some of those patients may or may not reschedule. That doctor could potentially take that revenue down the street to a surgery center or a site that is ready to go. You've potentially damaged your relationship with said surgeon as well. If he is one of your marquee surgeons or something that you're trying to bring into the healthcare facility because you're focused on cardiology or GI or whatever, orthopedics, spine, that's a big one right now in the marketplace where health systems are fighting for neuro and spine guys. So they want to make sure that their system is attractive to those, especially as we see that acute, non-acute sort of shift. Another is as your HTM team has to buy parts and services for aging equipment that either is long in the tooth, they're not supposed to be there, they're going to spend a lot of time in labor, they're going to a lot of time in parts on that piece. We talked about the cyber risks. Older equipment operates on older operating systems. Older operating systems, whenever they may jump to other operating systems, have cyber vulnerabilities. When you have a cyber vulnerability, it's effectively taking the guards off shift and allows for potential risk there. Whenever you have long in the tooth equipment, some of these contracts that we're talking about get lost in the shuffle from one contract terms pricing to the next contract terms pricing. That kind of falls by the wayside too. There's a ton of risks, not to mention that aging equipment becomes faulty. You don't want faulty equipment in there. You want best in class. You want the most innovative technology. Your time to do procedures is also lost whenever you've got a piece of equipment that is really aging. It takes twice as long for workarounds. And then another one that we talk about very frequently is change management of that type of equipment. So if you've got an entire floor, your ER department has these types of patient monitors, but then whenever you go down to surgery, now you've got a completely different set. Training the clinical staff on both of those types of equipments is like kind of cumbersome. It's kind of cumbersome for clinical staff too. That's when you'll start to get them to, start barking at you, hey, this one needs to be changed.
Danny, when those decisions are being weighed out, do we buy? Do we extend the life? How do we do this? I am really interested in understanding what that deferral may mean to general organizational performance and financial sustainability over time.
From a leasing perspective, it's pretty simple to understand. If you have a piece of equipment that you intended to use for 3 years, hypothetically, and you put it on a 3-year lease, once you get to the end of those 3 years in a fair market value lease, you've probably paid roughly for 90% of the value of that equipment had you just purchased it. So then if you properly send it back and refresh and upgrade at that time, you've accomplished what you intended to do with leasing because you've paid less than 100% for the value of that asset. When you go into just 6 months, 12 months of renewal or extension, each month you're still paying for that asset. Instead of paying for 90% of that asset, after 1 year, you've probably paid for 110% of that asset. And it's an easily budgetable number. So it's easy to just say, we're going to keep it for another year. So put that in the budget and then we'll readdress it next year. And then next year you do it again. So now you've paid 5 years for an asset that you intended to keep for 3 years. And your implicit interest rate in this transaction goes from 2% up to 27%. You have to make sure that either your contract supports flexibility at the end of term or that your useful life matches the lease term, or else it just gets very expensive very quickly.
I always pull our conversations back to patients because they're at the heart of everything that we do. Can we get your feedback on how these financial implications and that delayed investment has an impact on clinicians and care delivery that their patients are waiting on?
This is a space where I kind of join Vizient. I'm from the healthcare side, been in the OR, things like that. It's very near and dear to my heart. Health systems have their own analytics that they focus on. What is the need for the community? What demographics are they really trying to solve for? Health systems have certain strategies, whether it be in cardiology, oncology, aging population, bariatrics, all these different things. Whenever a health system has innovative technology and they've got the latest in surgeons or go into all these conferences, they're going to understand the best way to do their procedures in order to get the best patient outcome. A lot of the supplier community is also aligning their strategy to what practitioners are also sort of developing and focusing on. So whenever they have access to that, they're able to perform adequately for the greatest patient outcome. Getting the diagnosis as soon as possible, being able to perform the surgery as soon as possible, being able to get a health plan after or post-procedure, being able to sort of get all those things. But the root of that is, yeah, the gloves are important, sure. The pharmacy, all the drugs are important, but also the equipment is just as involved in that practice. And so you wouldn't use a 2-month-old box of gloves for a patient or last year's set of gloves.
You gotta have the fresh stuff.
You gotta have the fresh stuff,
Sure. Even in the best of circumstances, people are being creative with the supplies, the equipment at hand. They're budget conscious and cost controlled mindset. John, we talked a little bit about leases. What other creative funding models are you seeing emerge?
A ton is the short answer. Technology is changing very quickly. That's good in general. Like patients want the latest and greatest technology. You don't want to fly in a plane, from 25 years ago. You want to fly in a more modern plane. You feel more comfortable. That's a good thing. Where you have to be careful is the type of contract that you enter into when you acquire said equipment. And this is not to say anything negative about suppliers or vendors, but suppliers and vendors have a different goal than you do as a system. Your goal is to have the latest and greatest technology available to your patients when you need it for the right price. The vendor's goal is, in 5 years, we might have competition, and I want to make sure that I corner the market as long as I can to have my P&L be as best as it can. Too often, we see the vendors themselves, the suppliers, coming up with these new exotic agreements with all sorts of different names, pay-per-use, cloud agreements, pay-per-clicks, managed equipment services, you name it, down the line. And they do a very good job selling them to the various departments within a system, and nobody evaluates them properly against another way to pay for the equipment, whether it be cash or a traditional finance or operating lease. You used to go buy a car and they would tell you the price of the car is $20,000. Now you go to buy a car and they won't tell you the price. They tell you it's X per month, and it includes floor mats, oil changes, and free car washes, and it's X per month. And you say, what if I were to just buy it with cash? without all the extras. And they say, I'd have to go talk to my manager. It's X per month. They won't tell you the answer. It's by design. And it's not to say that all of these new agreements are necessarily bad. They may be the right choice for the right situation. Finance needs to be able to diagnose them and compare them to traditional ways of paying for this equipment, or else you wind up in trouble. So in 5 to 7 years from now, when you want to upgrade that technology and nobody read the contract enough to know that you can't, your only ability to upgrade certain technology is governed by your contract, and maybe you can't do what you want to do, now you're trapped and it's too late. It comes down to there's probably a list of 30 names for these types of new equipment. Nothing new. It's just packaging things in a different way. You need to make sure that you're understanding them, reviewing them, planning for them, and that the contract supports what you intend to do at the end of term.
As John and I are talking about this, the trouble that healthcare systems get into in that case is because there's somebody pushing finance. Correct. Hey, this needs to get done. This needs to get done. And now finance is in a crunch. And they're like, I really would have liked to look at this contract a little bit longer. Like whenever you're at the car dealership, hey, you're going to buy this car? Summer sales event's only going to happen for so long. Healthcare systems sort of get that same sort of pressure. They make the deal. They don't feel great about it, but the equipment is coming.
Does it help the financial leaders soften financial risk when they feel like they can still move a strategy forward, even though there's potential risk?
Maybe in the short term, largely due to lack of visibility, but in the long term, it only increases risk, assuming that the contract isn't doing exactly what the system wants it to do. Because now you've got downstream technology risk, legal risk, audit risk. You're now probably misaccounting for that equipment, which brings in audit risk and rating agency risk. In this world where financial pressure is so important and issuing bonds and having a great rating with the rating agencies is so important, imagine having some handful of agreements that you didn't even pay attention to as a CFO or a treasurer or VP of finance, all of a sudden impacting your rating. That's a huge deal. Individually, it's not a big deal. When you add them all up and it becomes tens of hundreds of millions of dollars that nobody's paying attention to, it becomes important. Right now, the rating agencies don't really know how to treat that either, but you're hearing more and more that they're considering it traditional debt. If all of a sudden that stuff becomes traditional debt and triggers covenants, that's a big problem.
To have those different ebbs and flows within a healthcare system, yeah, it's hard.
And I don't want to sound like I'm saying that these are all inherently bad. They're not. It's just that they need to be looked at carefully and thoughtfully. And most of the time, it's all reactionary and not planned.
Danny, let's talk about how the equipment and the strategic planning of those purchases start shifting into a strategic asset for service line growth. These are the pieces of equipment that will continue to support patient care and missions down the road. Give us a little sense of how capital equipment has moved from a necessary expense to how organizations can start thinking of it more as a strategic asset instead.
Whenever a healthcare system is forecasting what they should buy, they should align it to those goals or mission objectives. Don't just buy a piece of equipment because it's old. This is where John and I get to work together. If you've got a whole fleet of back tables within your healthcare system that should be purchased just because they're old, maybe you don't do those because you've got a list of ultrasounds that needs replacing. Get creative in your financing options. And you're like, hey, look, I need the ultrasound to push our objectives as a healthcare system forward. Maybe I don't need the OR tables as much. Maybe we don't change out some of the stuff in SPD because a couple of our MRIs are aging and those are very expensive. It's more important for healthcare systems to shift around the money in creative ways. Purchase the small things that you see. Utilize your volume to really make smarter, more long-term replacement strategies rather than just what is in the requisition list today. A large theme here that John and I are speaking about is reactionary is not the play. It causes a ton of leakage, a ton of risk. Doesn't align to goals. It's hard to manage. It's hard to get visibility to. You have to expand upon different processes, which expand into different platforms, which expands into different resources that you need. 90% of it can be avoided.
So let's pull that thread from a general market perspective. Every organization out there is trying to figure out how to grow service lines, grow their business, increase their margins. Given all of the factors that are in play today, how can leaders take capital planning and turn it into more of a competitive advantage in their strategy?
Involve finance and treasury earlier in the process instead of later in the process. Yeah. The natural tendency is to think of your capital approval process as the enemy. I won't get this fancy piece of equipment because it's not in my budget for this year, and therefore I'm going to try to find a creative way to do a workaround and get it in some way. That might work in the short term, but long term, that's not going to be helpful. The CFOs and treasurers need to be involved earlier, and this is on them as much as it is the supply chain and procurement and end user departments as well. It needs to be a communal strategic decision earlier, and you need to make sure that your contracts support the flexibility that you need as technology changes very quickly. In Danny's example, if you've got a bunch of back tables and you've determined that you need to go a different direction with the funds that you have in the short term, well, if all those back tables are on a lease that requires you to pay for them hell or high water for the next 2 years, there's not much you can do about that. You have a contract that's not supporting what you would like to do strategically as a business. So it's important to plan strategically for your purchases overall, then make sure that your finance and equipment lease contracts support the flexibility that you need around the technology that you're going to implement.
And as far as competitive advantage, I pose a question. I've got a 2014 Honda Civic, or I've got a new Chevy Blazer 2026 at the house. Which do you want to drive? You don't want to drive the Civic. It's got the manual window roll down. When a clinician comes in, they're going to know what your OR tables look like. They're going to know what your CTs look like. You can't really claim to be best in class in anything if you don't have best-in-class tools at your disposal. Most of our healthcare systems would agree that their marketing and marquee is best-in-class in X or Y. We are top innovators in X or Y. And you can't do those sorts of things as far as a competitive advantage goes if you don't have the best equipment in-house.
As we look ahead, next 3 to 5 years, what are some of the key trends that are going to have the greatest impact on capital planning?
I'll start, John. Right now, the industry is leaning into this space. I don't think that they have in a very long time. I've been in healthcare for a very long time, and this is the first time that I've seen capital equipment sort of rise to the surface. The market right now, like people fill up their gas tank. If you ask my friend, he waits until the very last minute, until the light comes on, and then he goes and fills up. There are certain places in our country where it's about 73%, if they have self-service options, that people will take their car to go get somebody else to fill it up. There's a convenience factor there. Somebody else is sort of taking care of it for me. And in most places, that is a 23% markup from if they would have filled up their own gas tank. People are utilizing subject matter experts. I don't know how to deal with this. I've got my own issue. I can't get out of my way for that for whatever various reason. That is the same in the gas industry as it is in capital. So there is a big issue. Most people have this issue. Health systems are very alike. And so they're looking to subject matter experts like myself, like John, to sort of correct this issue for us. Whether we like it or not, there's a lot of financial pressures. Help us get around that. At least help us get it to a state where we can manage it properly without throwing 4, 5, 6 FTEs at this thing and band-aiding a process until, cross our fingers, the budget seats start to align and the equipment starts to show up. That day is never coming. Us industry experts are helping healthcare systems get into the space. There are a lot of healthcare systems that understand that. They're being innovative. They're leaning into it. And they're just saying, help us out. Let us get to a place and then we'll manage from here.
We talked a little bit about how capital equipment has largely been an afterthought when you think about real estate and major strategic investments like M&A and capital markets and all these other big important things. Capital finance and equipment has been an afterthought. We're starting to see that change a little bit, which I think is great, but it comes with its own group of challenges. Making sure that you're doing it and focusing on it correctly is very important. Technology is changing rapidly. The systems that properly align themselves with those changes, both in terms of planning for capital acquisition, but also in terms of supporting that with the correct amount of financing versus cash and contracts in the case that you do financing, will wind up well ahead of their peers.
The capital on capital conversation is overdue. We've been talking about total cost of ownership and the capital space, but this is the first time we've actually paired capital investment banking strategies on top of it. What we've talked about today sheds a lot of light on a complex subject. So I'd like to be able to leave our listeners with one good, sound piece of advice for the future.
From my side, visualization, understand what you have is a key to knowing where you're going. Getting some visibility into your fleet of assets so you can appropriately plan for it is first step. If you can take that first step, that's key. This is a complex issue. It involves a lot of hands, a lot of eyes, a lot of people leaning in. People have to get comfortable with process change, with adapting new technologies in the space to help them with this issue. Our healthcare organizations within this country as a whole just have to start being uncomfortable with their maturity level.
John, do you see that in the same vein?
A simple question that these systems can ask in the equipment space these days as things change rapidly is, was this our decision or was this our supplier's decision? You need to take ownership of your decisions. How am I going to pay for it? And what's the best way to pay for it? Across that entire spectrum, too often today, systems are letting suppliers make those decisions for them, and they need to take ownership of that themselves.
Thank you, Danny and John, for sharing your perspectives and practical insights. It's been a great conversation. One of the key themes from today's conversation is that while financial pressures remain real, organizations don't have to choose between fiscal responsibility and strategic investment. The most successful healthcare leaders are finding ways to align capital decisions with organizational priorities, evaluating creative funding options, and focus on the resources where they can deliver the greatest impact. For more insights on capital planning, equipment strategy, and healthcare investment trends, visit VizientInc.com and subscribe to the Capital Compass wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Susan Edwards. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Capital Compass.